The 2015 general election is only 142 days away, and our aim is simple: to inspire the biggest turnout of young voters ever. I'm Michael Sarney, you're watching Leaders Live. In 2010, 3/4 of 18 to 24-year-olds didn't vote, making you the generation easiest to ignore. Tonight is your chance to grill another leader on the issues you care about. No sound bites, no spin, no ball. Because if you don't do politics, politics will do you. Helping us decide whether any of these leaders are worth your vote is our studio audience. They're not picked for their political expertise. They're here to bring your views and opinions into tonight's debate. If you've got questions or comments, contact them directly via their social media or to us at By the Ballot using the hashtag LeadersLive. Last week we had Ed Miliband, and tonight is the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg. Welcome, Nick. How are you?
It's good to be here. Yeah, very good.
Excellent. Thank you. Tonight, Nick's going to be talking about health, education and jobs. Our fourth topic, chosen by you, is immigration. OK, Nick, so in 1 minute, tell us who you are and what the Liberal Democrats stand for.
So I'm Nick Clegg. First, can I just say, love or loathe politicians, love or loathe individuals or political parties, do what you're doing and get people involved, because it's your future and your voice needs to be heard. Second thing, I think it's really, really important that you do that, particularly now, because there's a lot of politics of fear, a politics of anger, politics of grievance, politics of blame. And in my view, the risk is that we turn into quite a closed, mean-spirited country. And I think your voice, amongst others, could really help make sure that we remain a generous-spirited and an open-hearted country. And the third thing about me is, of all the things that I guess I've done in politics, probably the thing I've been proudest of, but I've probably spent most time doing in government, whether it's giving 2-year-old toddlers from the poorest families more help before they go to primary school, giving childcare support to 3- and 4-year-olds across the country, giving primary schools more money through the pupil premium, giving little kids at primary school a healthy meal to eat at lunchtime, is simply to make sure that particularly children when they're very young get the best possible start in life regardless of the circumstances of their birth. And that for me is what opportunity is all about.
OK, great. Thank you very much. And tonight's Nick's topic is jobs and the economy. Here's Ellen with a quick rundown.
We're still recovering from a double-dip recession. Unemployment levels are dropping, but they're still high, with lots of people in long-term unemployment. Young people come out of uni having spent thousands on an education only to find it incredibly difficult to find a job, let alone a graduate job. Even many people in work are losing money as their pay rises fail to match the rise in the cost of living, or are non-existent. And more people are having to retire later and later. OK, a nice overview from Ellen.
Yeah.
All right, Nick, so we've got almost 1 million 16 to 24s not in education, training or employment this summer. 500,000 are still looking for work. What are your job policies and why should they trust you?
So, a lot of it's very complicated, but one thing is very simple, is that you can't create jobs unless you've got a strong economy. It's kind of like as simple as that. And so, what we're recovering from as a country, and I sometimes think, and maybe it's, in fact, I'm sure it is the politicians' fault for not spelling this out more clearly, but I sometimes think that we don't fully appreciate quite how bad what happened in 2008 was. It wasn't just any old recession. This was just a massive collapse in the economy. It was just the heart of our economy, the banking system, just blew up. It just blew up, and we're still paying the price for that. And of course, one of the things that happened was that youth unemployment went up. Thankfully, it's now lower than it was when we came into office. We've seen some of the biggest drops in youth unemployment on record. I'm an MP in Sheffield. We've now got fewer youngsters who are NEETs, not in education, employment or training, than ever. We've doubled the number of apprenticeships that are supported across the economy compared to the last government, etc., etc., etc. But there's still some way to go. My view is that there were predictions 3 or 4 years ago that there'd be 3-4 million people out of work. In fact, we've got more people in work than ever before, more women in employment than ever before. But the issue, as I think your opening piece said, is what happens when lots of people go into work, particularly when they go into their first jobs, is they start on low-paid jobs. And so I think you've got to do 2 big things. One is make sure that people on low and middle incomes are taxed less, which is what this kind of whole thing that I've been you've probably heard me go on about for years now, which is taking people out of tax by raising the point at which you start paying income tax. And so next spring, you won't start paying any income tax till you earn £10,600, which compares to an allowance of £6,400 when we started. So that's almost 3 million people on low pay not paying any income tax. I think that helps. And the second thing is what they call in the jargon career progression, so that when you get your first job, your first feet on the jobs ladder, that you can go up that ladder. I think that's really, really important. And that's one of the things that I think the next government and the next parliament will have to spend a lot of time doing something about.
OK, well, what do you make of what Nick's saying? Tweet us using the hashtag YesNick if you agree and hashtag NoNick if you don't, and we will bring you the results throughout the show. On to our first question. It is Jack.
How's it going? Good evening, how are you?
I'm right, how are you?
Good, thank you. I have lots of friends who have found work but are struggling with zero-hour contracts, unpaid internships or minimum wage. Is there anything we can actually do to change that?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, zero-hour contracts, for instance, I think we've just got to end, and we are ending the absurd situation, which is deeply exploitative, where if you're signed up to a 0 hours contract, not only do you have all the uncertainties of that, but you're then not, the contract specifies you're not allowed to work for anybody else either, what they call in the jargon the exclusivity of it. So we're sort of stopping that. Minimum wage needs to be properly enforced. And minimum wage is thankfully going up. Went up to £6.50 in October. It's the largest leap upwards. I want to see the minimum wage. Oh, by the way, just on the minimum wage, not just the minimum wage at £6.50, but as you know, you've got 4 minimum wages. You've got £6.50, and then you've got 2 age-related minimum wages, and then you've got an apprenticeship minimum wage, which is at £2.73. That's very low. I'd basically like to see us get rid of that lower rung of the minimum wage altogether, the apprenticeship minimum wage, and put all apprentices on the age-related minimum wage, which is at about £3.79, I think it is. So I think you can increase the minimum wage, enforce it properly. We've massively increased the penalties against employers who don't pay the minimum wage. Scrap that lowest apprenticeship minimum wage, so even apprentices start on better pay, and more generally make sure that, of course, there are jobs to going around in the economy, so that people can move on to the next job, as I said earlier, once they've started their life in work.
Jack, did that answer your question?
Yeah, how about unpaid internships?
Oh, yeah,
that seems to be a really popular thing.
No, I don't think we should. I mean, some people say you should somehow sort of legislate to, specify exactly how an internship works. I think if you do that, you probably end up, there'll be some other route by which people, end up doing internships or work experience when it. What I want to change on internships is 2 things. Firstly, it should be about what you know, not who you know. So, for instance, I was really shocked when I came into government to discover that the internships in Whitehall, right, paid for basically by you, were all about. This is under the previous Labour government, was all about who they knew rather than what they knew. So we've scrapped that, made it completely meritocratic. And particularly, I think, in public bodies, that should be the case. In politics, you've still got lots of unpaid internships. We need to obviously move that to paying the costs for interns. But where an intern basically ends up doing a proper day's work, there shouldn't be an intern at all. And that's where I think we should come down really heavily on employers. If an internship is masquerading really as proper work, they should be on a proper contract and paid for properly. And that's where I do think we can come down on employers much more heavily.
How? How do we come down on the employers? What will they face if they do continue to do so?
Well, if you're not paying someone the minimum wage and you're not for a full day's work, then as I say, we've quadrupled, I think, the amount of financial penalties that employers face, and massively beefed up the kind of, the inspectors who go around going after employers. To be honest, I think when I've spoken to people who enforce the rules, they say that there are particular sectors which are notoriously bad, and so they tend to. They can't obviously inspect every single workplace across the country, but they do tend to kind of be led by the evidence of where the abuses are worse.
And is it easy for the individual? So if one of Jack's friends, for example, is being sort of exploited, how do they report that so someone can act on it?
I think you go online and report it relatively easily.
On Facebook?
I can check if it's a very good question. I can check if you like. But I mean, I know that the whole system of being able to report abuses and indeed go after them has been made a lot easier.
OK, we've had our first online question come in. Let's have a look. It's just come in now. OK, Harriet Bradley, how will you tackle unequal pay and gender discrimination in the workplace?
Well, I mean, first the good news and then the bad news. The good news is that the gender pay gap for people roughly under the age of 40 has now more or less disappeared in this country, it wasn't the case for a long time. So that's a really good thing. And the other good news is we've really pushed some things which are making a difference. For instance, we've got many more women on FTSE 100, the boards of big companies. There was a shocking lack of women on the boards of some of the biggest companies, and that's changed in a big way, not least because of the pressure of my colleague Vince Cable. We've got more women in work than ever before. But go above the age of 40, the gender pay gap is still very big. And my own view is that the next step should be that we should basically force all bigger companies, so let's say companies employing more than 250 employees, to have a kind of to be completely open to publish what the pay gap is. And to be fair to some employees, I've met some employeers who say, there's no gender pay gap in my company. No, absolutely not. In our company, absolutely not at all. It's not until they actually are forced to actually kind of jump through all the hoops. And like some of the big household companies now, where was I the other day? Some of the big accountancy firms, I think it's KPMG, PwC, they've taken the lead of publishing the gender pay gap in their companies. I think that's right. But what they lift a lid on a level of inequality which they weren't even aware existed in their own workplace. So I think that's the next frontier, if I can put it that way, of really dealing with this problem.
OK. Hannah?
I wanted to ask something that I've genuinely completely forgotten right now. Would you ever bring in a living wage?
I think living wage, thankfully, is being brought in, across huge parts of the country. I was talking to Ed Davey. He's a colleague of mine. He's the Secretary of State for Energy and Environment in Whitehall. He's introduced the living wage across his whole department in Whitehall. A bunch of councils have done that. So it's starting to take root. I think the reason why very few people are recommending that you kind of impose the living wage instead of the minimum wage is that there's this independent body called the Low Pay Commission, which was, I think it was set up in the previous government. But anyway, it's a very good thing because it basically takes the kind of analysis of the effect of what people are paid on how many jobs are created out of the hands of politicians. And so independent advice is provided by this Low Pay Commission. And that's where they set the minimum wage. They say the minimum wage should be X, and we think this is consistent with creating the maximum number of jobs in a growing economy. And clearly, the living wage being far higher than the minimum wage, their analysis would be that would then have a knock-on effect of fewer jobs in the economy. So that's the balance you're trying to strike.
What about the people that are at home now or online now, looking at this and thinking that the living wage doesn't even sort of benefit them right now? The cost of living's gone up, limited disposable income. How do we sort of ensure that people can live a good life, pay their bills?
Yeah, sure. Well, you've got to try and keep the bills down. Obviously, that's the first thing. So that's why we've kept council tax, frozen it across the country. That's why we've made sure that a lot of the fuel duty increases, the fuel duty escalator, which was planned previously, was basically been cancelled. It's the biggest thing of all is this tax change I've talked about. I mean, that's worth over £800 to over 26 million people. It's a massive. So someone on the minimum wage. So we've cut their tax by 2/3 because of that move alone. Try to keep energy bills stable and down, and so on. So you've got to do that. But I think the answer to the living wage, Hannah, is I think it's an incredibly good and powerful thing. I know you didn't ask me this, but I think the next question is, if it's a good and powerful thing, why don't you kind of instruct everybody else to do it? And I'm just trying to explain to you why I think there's a sort of balance between having a minimum wage and then encouraging the payment of the living wage.
OK, guys, well, we're going to have to move on. Let's find out what people are making of your job policies. Nick, the results are in. 58% hashtag yes, Nick. So you've got more people agreeing with you at the moment. Happy?
Best opinion poll I've seen in ages.
OK. Our next topic with Nick is education, and here's Sam to give us a quick overview.
Instead of helping students achieve their dreams, teachers are forced to focus on exam grades. Sure, it might be the best solution so far, but putting all kids of all abilities in front of the same exam paper just isn't fair. We're currently living in a country where students who want to learn can't afford to go to university. The reason? Because people like you and me don't vote. The government wants to focus on the older generation because they're a lot more engaged than we are, but this is something we need to change. I want to know why the government isn't educating younger people about politics. The government needs to be doing more to engage kids, and that means it's going to put a whole lot less pressure on teachers to reach results. And by doing this, we can make a more positive working environment.
OK, so good points from Sam there. Education was your second topic. It's a bit of a brave choice, right?
No, it's what I'm passionate about.
OK, so in 60 seconds...
yeah.
In 60 seconds, tell these guys what your policies are and if they can trust you to deliver them.
Yeah, well, no, I'll try, but in a minute. But can I just... I mean, there's quite a lot that I agree with what Sam said. There's quite a lot I disagree with. But can I just say two things that I feel really passionately about, where I actually think... I like to think what I've done, what my party's done, is really, really push things in the right direction. Firstly, all the evidence is, ask any teacher, I'm a dad of 3 little boys, ask any parent, if you really want to have a fair education system, you've got to start early. You've got to start early. You've got to help kids even before they've hung up their coat the first day at primary school. And that's why we've transformed the help that's given, particularly to kids from the poorest backgrounds when they're 2-year-old. Two-year-olds are now getting help for the first time ever because of decisions we've taken. Universal childcare and preschool support for 3- and 4-year-olds on a scale never seen before. The early years pupil premium, something I wrote about 10 years ago, which we're now doing. £2.5 billion of extra money into the schools to help kids from the poorest backgrounds. Healthy meals at lunchtime so they concentrate well. Start early. And the second thing is, I know I'm running out of time, second thing is get rid of this terrible snobbery that says an academic qualification is better than a vocational qualification. That's why doubling the number of apprenticeships is so important. We should be putting vocational skills and academic skills on the same pedestal and cherishing and esteeming them exactly the same way. I think we are. Got some way to go, but I think we're taking the right steps in the right direction.
OK, do you agree with what you're hearing tonight? Tweet us using the hashtag YesNick if you agree and hashtag NoNick if you don't. We'll bring you the results in a few minutes. Our first question is from Eliza.
Hey, this is a question that has been coming back to me after I've asked people what they want to ask you quite a lot. So I've put it in my own words. After apologising for breaking your tuition fees pledge, you said you'll never make a promise to the British people again unless you're absolutely sure that you can keep it. Why can't you promise tonight to scrap the £9,000 tuition fee system and, if you're part of another coalition government in May, fight to keep that promise?
So I think I've learnt my lesson that I shouldn't make promises on that whole issue of how we fund universities without being really sure that it's right in the first place, and secondly it can be kept.
Is it not right then? What I'm saying?
What do you mean?
Bringing the fees down.
So can I just explain? Because it's quite important, this. So fees, as you know, were introduced a long time ago, right? Back in, was it 2003, and then increased. You had the election, no one won the election. Big problem for me was I wasn't Prime Minister. I've got 9% of MPs in the House of Commons, so compromises were inevitable. And on this one, there's no way that the Liberal Democrat policy could have prevailed, and I probably should have realised that kind of with hindsight, that we were only going to be able to implement this policy if we'd won outright, because both the Conservative and Labour parties, one of them, the Labour Party, had introduced fees and increased them, and the other one wanted them to go up further. So whether we'd gone into coalition with Labour or the Conservatives, the result would have been the same. So we did the next best thing, Eliza, which is a system which obviously born out of a huge amount of controversy. Nonetheless, and this is where Sam is just, and I don't say this accusatorily, but he's just factually wrong, where you don't have to pay anything up front, which is unlike the old system. Thousands of students used to pay up front under the old system if they were on part-time courses, and you only pay back when you can afford to do so. And I think the reason why and this is really important, because forget my apology, forget the politics for a minute. What I really do care about is that people understand that the system doesn't in any way limit anyone from going to university if they want to. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. If you were to leave university and go for a graduate job, quite a lot of graduate jobs, average income in this country now is what, 24,000 quid, right? Let's say you've got a job at £24,000 once you've graduated. Under the old system, under Labour's old system, you were paying, it's about just over £67 per month if you were earning £24,000 for having gone to university. Under the new system, yes, you pay longer, but you pay less than a third of that. You pay just over £22 a month. And this is the reason, by the way, why all the predictions at the time that no one would go to university, that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds wouldn't go to university, that kids from black minority ethnic backgrounds wouldn't go to university, have proved, thankfully, not to be the case. We've got more people applying to go to university than ever before, more kids from disadvantaged backgrounds at university than ever before, higher proportion of kids from black minority ethnic backgrounds going to university than ever before, because people have got their calculators out and worked out they don't have to pay anything if they can't afford to. If they don't work, they don't pay anything. If they pay anything below, they earn anything below 21,000, they pay nothing, and they only pay what they can afford. And the only reason I give you that explanation is not in any way to sort of absolve the controversy, the political controversy. I've taken it on the chin, and I wish sometimes some of my colleagues in other parties would apologise for things that they have not, done when they said they would. But setting that aside, because what I do care about, which is why, because of me, we have poured billions of pounds into the education system where it makes a massive difference when kids are very small, is because I passionately believe to my very core of my being as a liberal that a liberal fair society is one where people get the best possible start in life regardless of the circumstances of their birth.
Do you think that we should be charged for education at all?
Well, look, the thing about higher education is that we inherited a system, as I say, where there was the cake, if you like, was divided between what taxpayers paid for people at university, so even taxpayers who hadn't gone to university, and what graduates paid because they'd been to university. And that, as I say, was a system not introduced by the government of which I'm Deputy Prime Minister, but it's this system we inherited. Now, you're quite right, my party wanted to scrap that system. We couldn't for the reasons that I explained.
Other countries have it free, though, don't they?
Some do, some don't.
Scotland.
Some do, well, yes, we'll see what happens in the future, because the Scottish, if you speak to anyone who knows anything about the Scottish education system, the university system, they'll tell you it's completely unsustainable financially. And look, we are living, as I said, for the reasons I said earlier, we're living at a time when our country suffer this massive cardiac arrest in our economy.
Right.
But it's very important, this, because you've got to cut your cloth to sort of according to what you earn. I think the latest independent estimates are that come the year after next, our economy will be a full 11% smaller than it would have been if the crash in 2008 had not happened. So you have to put sort of square pegs into round holes to make sure you can afford the kind of education system you want. And as I said, whilst we're obviously not doing what I would have liked if I was Prime Minister and I'd won the election, we did try and do the next best thing. And I think the fact that now we've got more people going to university than ever before, youngsters on full-time courses than ever before, is a sign that maybe the system actually is working differently and better to what was predicted at the time.
All right, let's bring in an online question. We've got an online question coming. OK, Hunar 10. Should we introduce political studies in the national curriculum across the UK?
So, you've got citizenship stuff. You know a lot about this. You've done a lot of work on
careful.
it. Oh, I've learned to be careful.
Citizenship's only half the schools, because academies don't have to follow it, free schools don't have to follow it.
Exactly. So that's
half the GCSE.
Right, well, you answer the question then.
No.
I was going to come to that. I think there are various requirements. Citizenship is one of them. Relationship and sex education is another one, where the requirement, completely irrationally in my view, applies to maintained schools, but not to academies or free schools, for instance. I think that doesn't make any sense at all.
All right,
if you've got a curriculum requirement like that, I think most mums and dads would like the curriculum to the kind of core curriculum of what's being imparted and taught to our kids to apply to any school, regardless of what the name of the school is on the school gates. Yeah, great. Well, you've got a lot of successful people in this audience. Let's just, by a show of hands, how many of you knew you could register to vote at 16?
I do now, but not then.
Right. And how many of you were told about voter registration in school? Felt as though you had a stake in society in school? Really successful people, are we not missing out on them adding something to our society because we're not engaged in a moment?
Yeah, absolutely.
How are we going to fix that?
Well, partly the work that people like you do, partly the work that electoral registration officers do around the country. So the whole system Mike's aware of this, but just I hope some of you are at least, is changing completely. So the old kind of like slightly patronising system was that you could get registered to be able to vote by someone basically doing it on your behalf. It was this kind of totally outdated Edwardian idea that the head of the household would basically declare to the authorities who could vote in the household. Now, quite rightly, it's become an online thing. You can do it in 2 or 3 minutes. Very, very straightforward, dead simple, and you have to do it as an individual. And the point that I think Mike and others have been making is that we've got to explain to people that they've now got to, take a step themselves online to get themselves registered. Well, it's a bit more complicated. Actually, sorry, it's a bit more. No, it's not. It's not complicated. Actually, it's more simple. Quite a lot of people have been moved from a whole bunch of databases automatically onto the new electoral register. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is that the way you register now is quite different to the outdated, quite patronising way, paternalistic way, and I choose that word carefully because there's always this assumption there'd be a male, usually male head of the household who declare who could vote in that household. But we do need to, obviously, massively. I'm at the moment battling to get a whole lot of money out of Whitehall into the hands of electoral registration officers so they can go into colleges and schools and get people registered using this new method.
All right, we're going to take 3 comments. Miles, Rosianna and Jamal, thank you.
It's interesting you talking about the system and how it works. I've had lots of...
Electoral registration?
Or just generally with the political system, because we're trying to engage young people to vote. There are a lot of angry people last time who voted because of your policies on tuition fees and you've gone back on it. And you will tell us, as you say, you didn't win the election, your 4 main policies were on the front page of the manifesto and kept. But can you give us something tangible of at what point in the... discussions with Conservatives that you decided, OK, we're not going to do it anymore? And with that in mind, is the system actually, there is no safeguards? You can make, any politician can make promises, and actually it doesn't...
Yeah, no,
we'll hear all 3.
Sorry, yeah.
I just had another question, if you could come back to it after. We saw in big campaigns this year to kind of ban bossy in the playground, where girls are called bossy and boys are called the boss. What would the Lib Dems do to promote gender equality in schools?
OK, and JB?
And I've got one from Twitter as well, from Luke, saying the current policy on education is that it's compulsory for young people to stay in education until 18. Would your party reverse this back to the age of 16? And what benefits do you think this would have for people with less academic but more vocational skills?
Can I take them in reverse?
Yeah.
Otherwise I'm going to forget them. No, I wouldn't actually. I think making sure that... So we've raised, you're right, the age of sort of participation in educational training from 16 to 17 last year and then 18 this year, I think, in steps to 18. I think on the whole that's a really good thing to do, so we wouldn't want to reverse that. Having said that, I do think there are some major issues of kind of access to good education. Particularly, by the way, for instance, if you take transport, I'm not sure if you've come across this a lot. I don't know where do you live?
West London.
Yeah, well, in London it's not the same. If you speak to, I don't know, a youngster in rural Somerset trying to get to college, several miles away, they're having to shell out hundreds of pounds just to get.
That travel card came through where you can get 1624, you get 30% off. I remember that.
Well, no, in London you get a big deduction, and in some places it's free. In other parts of the country it's not. So one of the first things I'd want to do is not reduce the age of participation, but make sure that 16 to 21-year-olds get under my party's policy, which we will be campaigning on in the run-up to the election, a 2/3 reduction wherever they live in the country, even where the deductions don't presently exist, a 2/3 deduction off their bus travel, their bus transport costs, because it's a huge impediment to teenagers, to youngsters going to college, often across big distances. How we pay for it, by the way, in part we pay for it, which I think is really fair, by asking very wealthy people who are retired not to have their winter, their winter fuel payments and their TV licences subsidised by poorer taxpayers, which is the quite irrational
because they vote.
What?
Basically, their benefits because they...
No, but it's a really important point you make. Is at the moment it's just too taboo. It's treated too much as a taboo to ask wealthy retired people to make a bit of a sacrifice. In this case, to help younger people get on a bus to be able to get a good education. And I think that's a good example.
Be in the manifesto.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And if the coalition...
So absolutely, what we want to remove... Well, I will come to Miles's point, because it's a really important point, this.
I don't need to get out of this.
No. No, I understand that,
We're going to have to be quick.
Okay,
we're going to have to be quick.
Oh, well, just ask me questions in the middle of an answer then. I can't, but the policy is 2/3 off your bus pass if you're 16 to 21, partly paid for by asking wealthy retired people to give up some of the benefits they get, right? On the middle one, I think one of the most powerful things, and actually Miriam, my wife, does this a lot, sort of voluntarily. She's part of a campaign called Inspiring Women. You get women who've done well, or even actually women who've just kind of, just kind of are happy with what they've done and want to tell maybe the school they used to attend, or just some girls who are thinking about what they might want to do in the future, go into schools and have positive role models, female role models. So girls don't just assume that they're going to go in one sort of track, but they think big, dream big about what they want to do in the future. Miles, you, I think, have genuinely kind of put the spotlight on one of the biggest dilemmas, I think, in British politics, as we move away from the old-fashioned politics where the government of the day was like a game of pass the parcel between the Conservative and Labour parties, and where the pendulum just swung effortlessly from the blue team to the red team and back, and where we've got much more fluid multi-party politics. UKIP's doing well, SNP's doing well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where the results are going to be much more uncertain. And your question is, if the results are going to be uncertain, and they're going to be compromises, how do we know kind of what you're going to compromise and what you're not? Now, my answer, as you anticipated, is we actually put it on the front page of our manifesto. And that is important. So that was the choice that my party took. We said we were going to deliver the pupil premium I talked about earlier, take lots of people out of income tax by raising the point that you pay income tax, push for political reform, and sort out the banks and sort out the economy. Now,
sorry to interrupt, but I was asking, can you give a tangible moment in which, as a party, you said we're now going to back out from this promise? Because there must have been a moment.
No, it was very, very obvious to me within very early discussions with both David Cameron and Gordon Brown that the Liberal Democrats, that we were completely isolated. The two larger parties agreed with each other more than they agreed with our policy on tuition fees. So we had no sort of leverage on that. But also, the point you did actually also ask, how do we know kind of what parties will? What are the kind of things you'll really kind of die in the ditch for? What are the things you're really going to dig your heels in for? And that's a perfectly fair question. And as I said, the clue for us was what was on the front page of our manifesto. And to be fair to us, okay, we've had a lot of grief, perhaps rightly, for the tuition fee stuff. But actually, we've stuck religiously, like a sort of tablet of stone, to the 4 things we said on the front page of our manifesto. And we've delivered them. Not only delivered them, in one important respect, on the tax allowance, we've over-delivered on it. Because we said on the front page of our manifesto, you could earn 10,000 quid tax-free. We've pushed it up to 10,600. And that's more or less the same approach we'll take in the run-up to the May election as well. It'll be interesting to see whether the other parties do. Because, of course, the Labour and the Conservative parties are going to have to get used to the idea that they won't be able to necessarily implement their manifestos in full.
Let's find out what people are making of your education policies, Nick. The results are in. 45% yes, 55% no. What do you think?
It's just like the Scottish referendum. Identical.
The third topic you've chosen is health. Here's Lena with some insight.
Our NHS, our great British National Health Service, was formed as a political and cultural reaction to the depression of the 30s and the devastation of the Second World War. People in other countries have to pay to get well. What the hell? The fact that people my age in the UK have grown up with the NHS, and in some cases literally born into it, often mean that it's an assumed and almost invisible pillar of society for us. But can you imagine a Britain without it?
OK, interesting points from Lena. 1 minute on health, so...
2 points, which I hope we can do in less than 1 minute. 3 points. It's like the Monty Python sketch. 3 points. Firstly, you're absolutely right. Lena says we've got to cherish, defend, promote, protect, never allow anyone to tamper with the basic virtue of the NHS, which is there for everybody, free at the point of use, based on need, not the ability to pay. Second point, we've got to overcome this. I think it's a kind of almost Dickensian kind of form of discrimination against mental health and the way that's dealt with, as opposed to physical health. I talked earlier about how we've got to make sure that vocational and academic qualifications are put on the same pedestal. We've got to treat physical and mental health with the equality of esteem. Done a whole bunch of things on that, which I can talk about. That's very important. And thirdly, the way in which we provide social care to the elderly and the vulnerable, the way social care and the NHS work together, we've got to improve that, because we've got far, far too many elderly people who are in hospital for long periods of time and then stay in hospital beds for longer than they need to because they haven't been able to get back home and be looked after either at home or in a home through social care. So defend the NHS, mental health, boost it, and bring the NHS and social care together.
OK, guys, as we carry on, let us know if you agree with the points Nick's making. Tweet #YesNick if you agree and #NoNick if you don't. We'll bring you results in a few minutes. Our first question is from Gracie.
Hi. Michelle Humphreys tweeted me and asked, it sounds like you're taking mental health seriously, but as you've been completely ignored by the Conservatives when it comes to drugs policy, how can we be sure that your ideas on mental health won't be ignored if you're in another coalition next May?
I think judge me by my actions rather than my words, I would say to Michelle. It's not just talk. I've actually, I've found, £120 million for the first time ever, as of, next year, start having access standards, waiting time standards for people who, are suffering from depression or psychosis or other mental health conditions, which we've had these waiting times, these access standards in physical health for years. Why on earth we've not got them in mental health? That will make a massive, massive change. We've changed the constitution, the mandate of the NHS, to make it a legal obligation on people working in the NHS to treat mental health with the same kind of care that they do physical health. And I recently announced a total transformation about the help we give to particularly youngsters with eating disorders. I mean, anorexia is now the biggest mental health killer in this country. There are some truly shocking instances of kids as young as 6, 7, 8, 9 who've got eating disorders. And they're just being left to suffer on their own. And so I've announced a new change to this. We will train up a whole bunch of people who can intervene with youngsters at an earlier stage, and also their family can be guaranteed that rather than just being put on medication and kind of parked, they're properly treated in a more speedy fashion than has been the case at the moment. So my answer to Michelle would be, we're doing stuff. We're not just talking about stuff.
Yeah.
Nick, the government you're part of has sold off Royal Mail and is now selling off East Coast trains without asking the people. Is the NHS really safe with the Liberal Democrats?
Yeah, it is. It is. You've got to remember that private sector operators in the NHS, they've been around for some time. It's not a new invention. It didn't sort of happen in May 2010. In fact, we inherited a situation where I think that about 5% of the total of all NHS contracts went to the private sector. It's now 6%. So the previous government presided over 5%. We've added 1%. And in fact, what happened in the past, which I thought was totally outrageous, was that the Department of Health, do you remember, I'm not sure if there was a health secretary called Patricia Hewitt under the Labour Party who did a lot of this, to kind of, in the name of somehow trying to shake up the NHS, they basically gave these sweetheart deals to private sector companies. About £250 million, £250 million worth of sweetheart deals were signed with private sector contractors to deliberately undercut the NHS. We've made that illegal. So it is now illegal because of a law we've passed to give those sweetheart deals to the NHS, to the private sector, competing with the NHS.
You said before that the tuition fees were unsustainable. And with our ageing population, some people say the NHS is unsustainable.
I don't believe that.
So, well, where's the money going to come from to pay for it?
Short answer, Nick.
You've got to make some big choices, don't you? You've got to make some big choices. So my party said that we'll, on top of all the extra money that's going to the NHS, we'll put another £1 billion in there by asking the people at the very top to pay more in tax, for instance. So we'll ask the very wealthiest, for instance, to pay roughly the same tax on their dividends and their shares as they do on their income tax, for instance. With a fairer tax system, you can put more money in the NHS, but you also have to do the other things I talked about, particularly bringing social care and healthcare together. We waste a huge amount of money and create a lot of misery in our society by not having people come in and out of hospital more quickly and being looked after in home or in the community better. So I totally reject this idea that it's unsustainable, but you do need to reform it, just as you also put more money into it.
OK, let's go to an online question. We've got one just coming in. OK, Ryan Daniel Coley. Why do Lib Dem campaign against the privatisation of the NHS at a local level, but do not at a national level?
I think I probably answered that. We're not privatising the NHS, as I said. In fact, we've ended the outrage of giving the private sector preferential treatment that used to happen. So.
OK, right, guys, same again. We're going to bring in, so Hannah, Rosianna, did you have another one?
Yep.
Yeah. And on the end. Okay.
So I've got a question from Tess Rach on Twitter. She was asking what your policies are on healthcare in terms of mental health issues that may affect LGBTQ youth.
Courtney says, can you ask what can be done to reduce costs of prescriptions for people suffering long-term conditions?
And Daniel asks, how would you propose improving people's awareness, involvement and choice in regards to NHS governance?
So on the first, to be honest, it's not just about the mental health problems for one part of our community or society or another. It's about mental health generally. We've got to take mental health out of the shadows. It was treated like, it was talked about with embarrassment if it was talked about at all. We've got to, 1 in 4 people have a mental health issue at one point or another. If you go to a doctor and they think you might have cancer, you are sent within 2 weeks for a referral. Because of these new waiting standards I've talked about, it's only from next year that for the first time, if you've got an episode of psychosis as a young person, for instance, that you know that you're going to be treated in exactly the same way as someone who's suspected of having cancer. You've got 2 weeks and you'll be seen. And this sounds very techie, but I know it's really important. Part of the problem, the reason why the mental health service has been shortchanged and under-resourced for so long, was that the rest of the NHS, hospital trusts and so on, were paid according to activity. So the more they kind of help patients, the more they get paid. Whereas mental health trusts were paid in a block. And so what that meant was that every time the number crunchers had to make some savings, of course, the easiest thing to do was just to shave some money off that block grant. And that was very, very unfair. So we're shifting the funding for mental health trusts onto the same footing as other parts of the NHS. I think that'll make a huge difference for everybody. As you know, there's a huge amount that goes on, negotiations between the NHS and the big pharmaceutical companies to make sure that the medicines that are available affordably. There's a big controversy at the moment about a particular medicine that is available for a very particular condition, where it's the availability of that, even though it's been recommended clinically by this important clinical quango called NICE, is not available because there's so much wrangling about price. And I think the NHS is big enough to actually drive a hard bargain, which is on our behalf, which is a good thing. How do you get people more involved in governance? I think my experience is the best way to get people involved is to get people interested and involved locally in their own community. And actually what's happening in these recent reforms, controversial though some of them is that actually the way in which the NHS is being governed is being radically decentralised. So you've got these new things called these clinical commissioning groups, so decisions are taken by doctors and clinicians locally about what is needed for local areas. So I think local is the route to get involved in the governance of your own local NHS.
Jack?
Yeah, could I just add? I think the work you're doing around mental health is great, by the way, so credit to you. But it seems to me that it's still a taboo, especially at school levels, like being gay once was or being black and white once was. Yeah. Does more not need to be done in schools to reduce the taboo? Yeah,
totally. So I'll give you an example of trying to do something about it from within government. I've set up within government a new kind of mental health task force, which I chair. Jeremy Hunt, the Secretary of State for Health, he's the vice chair. I had the first meeting of it just actually this afternoon, bringing together people from across government, including Nicky Morgan, the Secretary of State for the school system. And I've asked her to come back in January with a plan about how the school system can work with the child, adolescent mental health trusts, what they call in the jargon CAMs. Because they just don't, it's a bit like social care in the NHS, these systems don't talk to each other. And you're quite right, there are still too many teachers. There's some, of course, brilliant teachers who know to look out for the telltale signs of mental health distress and mental health problems. But there's still far too many teachers who don't feel confident. So we need to work out how to train up more teachers so that they can look out for the telltale signs, so that youngsters, particularly youngsters with some of the eating disorders we talked about earlier, get to be seen and helped and treated earlier.
Thanks. OK, so you've been busy voting on Twitter, whether you agree or disagree with Nick's ideas. Here is a snapshot of the results. 60% yes, so we've gone up. Happy?
Yes, I'm always happy, but I'm delighted to see. No, I suspect that's partly because of the interest that people have in mental health issues, and it's one of the really interesting things I've discovered in politics. It's just a little window into politics. There was this sort of unspoken view that you shouldn't go on in politics about mental health, that it's a bit, somehow not a mainstream political issue. And I remember some people were saying to me when I announced back in the autumn that this was going to be on the front page of our manifesto in the run-up to the next general election, absolute thing that we will sort of dig our heels in whatever situation we find ourselves. People say, oh, really, is that a bit of a risky thing to do? Actually, the public response, as that poll shows, has been overwhelmingly positive that we should do something about this, because everybody intuitively knows that what we're doing at the moment as a society is just wrong.
Fourth and final topic, chosen by you online, was immigration, and here's our friend Harry with a little bit about it.
1 in 3 people believe that the tensions between immigrants and UK-born citizens is the main reason for division in the country. There's 100,000 more people coming in than there are going out. There are people being enslaved because of the management of the immigration policy in this country. As a 19-year-old kid, I've got my first vote coming up in the general election. I think it's a failure that I don't know more about this.
OK, good intro from Harry there. So, Nick, we've heard from Natalie, Nigel and Ed. Tell us what your policies are on immigration.
In a minute.
1 minute.
We've got to be fair but firm. When I say fair, we've got to remember, as I said at the outset, we've got to remain an open-hearted, generous-spirited country. Just sort of turning our backs on the world, like Nigel Farage and large parts of the Conservative Party, it's not only mean-spirited, it's also self-defeating. 1 in 7 companies and businesses in this country were started by people who came in as kind of migrant entrepreneurs. Our NHS would collapse overnight if we didn't have nurses and doctors from elsewhere. So we've got to be open and fair where we need to be open and fair, and in keeping with our sort of generous-spirited traditions. But also we've got to give people like Harry confidence that the system works. And that's why, for instance, I think we should be counting people out as well as counting them in, having proper border controls. Because if you don't have proper border controls, you don't know who's here, and you don't know whether people have overstayed their visa, for instance, or not. We should be bearing down on unscrupulous employers who employ people from elsewhere below the minimum wage. That's totally out of order. We should be bearing down on illegal immigration. So it's got to be fair. We are an open economy. We're an open society. We're a generous-hearted society, but firm where it needs to be firm. That's the balance we need to strike.
Let us know if you're in favour of Nick's policies on immigration by tweeting #YesNick if you agree and #NoNick if you don't. We'll bring you results in a few moments. We're ready for our first question, Rosianna?
Yeah, this is one someone sent in saying, a lot of people are saying immigration is the most important issue facing the UK today. Why don't you take on these issues? People are worried about overcrowded classrooms, soft touch benefits and overstretched GP surgeries.
I think you can take it on, but what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to pander to it. And that's what, Nigel Farage and UKIP and large parts of the Conservative Party do. They're not actually addressing these anxieties are totally understandable. It's not for politicians to sneer at voters. If the public, we are the servants of the public. If the public are telling us, as they are, this is something which they're really worried about, you've got to address them. But you've got to address them, not kind of make them worse by somehow kind of seeking to kind of claim that we can, put up the drawbridge and wish the rest of the world away, which is what seems to be the response of others, which, as I say, doesn't work, be economically self-defeating, and actually what it does, it sort of pretends that we can do something or should do something as a country, which I think would leave us poorer and weaker. So it's all about having a sensible balance, bearing down on the illegal immigration, properly reintroducing the border controls that I talked about earlier, counting people out as well as they count them in, that were scrapped by previous governments, but not chucking overboard our kind of, open-minded, generous-spirited values as a country.
Can I just follow up on that a bit? So that question came from someone who is clearly very worried about immigration, but I'm a daughter of an immigrant, so I have a slightly different perspective. And I feel like no one's really talking about the racial aspect to this, and people kind of dancing around it because no one wants to say, oh, that person's racist, but it seems like those anxieties have a racial tinge to them, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Well,
exactly. I mean, if the debate about immigration, a legitimate debate, topples into a sort of covert or sort of surrogate form of racism, that's grotesque. It's totally out of order. But for instance, I'll give you a good example. There's a totally legitimate debate to be had, and it's raging at the moment, about when people move around the European Union, like, what does that mean for their rights to access benefits as they go from one country to the other? Now, I've got a very simple rule of thumb, which is I think moving around the European Union is a great right and a prerogative that we all have. In fact, over 1.5 million Brits live and work elsewhere in the European Union. But I think the freedom to move is not the same as the freedom to claim. Now, it's not the same. So I don't think people should be able to expect to come here and get sort of benefits which they've not contributed towards, no questions asked on the first day they turn up. In the same way, I don't think a Brit going elsewhere should expect, if they're looking for work in Germany, for instance, to immediately get benefits paid for by German taxpayers. So, that's a legitimate debate to be had. And I've been very much at the forefront in saying, let's be really clear, freedom to move around the place, yes, freedom to claim, they're not the same thing. So that's a legitimate debate, but you don't have to disfigure that debate through some kind of, by making it a debate about race. It's not. It's about fairness in the rules. That's what the debate is all about.
Tom?
Aren't you making this debate about claiming benefits when it really isn't? Such a tiny proportion of immigrants come to claim benefits. People come to work. And so trying to shift the debate is really being disingenuous. But what isn't the problem that people, and a lot of people have been saying this on Twitter tonight, the problem is they feel that the politicians have no control over the borders. It's not about the numbers and it's not about the race of people that come, but it's about that sense of control and that sense of being able to kind of have some control over our borders. And what particularly a person called a libertarian rebel, who I don't think really likes you very much, has been saying is,
Thank you for the warning.
as long as we're in the EU, we can't control EU migration.
Right.
And I just wondered if you thought that maybe immigration, do you think immigration is too high or too low at the moment?
So I've never believed there's some magic statistic where it's all okay if the population is X million, but if it's X million plus one because someone's suddenly come off a ferry at Dover, it's all suddenly too much. I don't think it works like that. But you clearly need to make sure that public services are, properly supported for the population that we have, and the rules of the system work fairly. So that's my point. Of course, you're right to say, for instance, the people who come to work here from elsewhere tend to claim far fewer benefits than we do, than the British citizens do. But that, just because it's not statistically as big a problem as some people might say, doesn't mean it's not important to make sure the rules are fair. I mean, in that sense, what people feel is just as, if not more important than in a sense, the dry statistics.
Isn't that feeling about control, though?
Well, that's what I was going to come to. On the control issue, look, we do need to make sure that, as I say, we count people in and count people out in the way, we just don't have an estimate at the moment because previous governments removed those proper border checks about how many people have overstayed their visas, for instance, which is, by the way, the biggest problem of illegal immigration. Of course, one of the really visible problems of illegal immigration is people coming in illegally, clinging onto a lorry as they come from Calais. Actually, the biggest problem, by far, is people coming here legally on a visa and then staying beyond the expiry date of their visa. But you don't know who that is if you don't check people when they leave. So I think there is much more we can do to enforce control. But do I believe the solution, which I accept that UKIP is making a powerful case that appeals to some people, saying if you really want control, we've got to pull ourselves out of the European Union altogether. Well, fine. But if we do that, we'd make ourselves poorer, we'd put more people out of work. We wouldn't be able to do a whole bunch of things that we can do by working together in the European Union, whether it's acting on climate change or dealing with cross-border crime or attracting investment to create employment in this country. So,
So do you think those things are more important than migration?
I think they're more important. It's about, do you know what? I know it sounds desperately sort of, desperately kind of balanced, but it is about a balance. You've got to strike the right balance and don't pretend to people there is some false, easy, shortcut solution. All we need to do is just yank ourselves out of the European Union, all will be well. I mean, if you listen to UKIP and parts of the Conservative Party, you'd think the sun would shine forever, there would never be a traffic jam again, no child would ever weep. Human happiness would settle like the morning mist on the whole country if only we pull ourselves out of the European Union. It's ridiculous. Actually, with 3 million jobs directly dependent, in one way or another, on our position in what is the world's largest marketplace, we'd make ourselves poor, we'd chuck people out of work. Is that a price worth paying?
Final comments then. Come on, Miles.
You say you're not pandering to UKIP, but generally in the media and politics, the debate is around immigration, would you say that immigrants are actually being used as a scapegoat for abuses done by the 1%?
Answer that in a sec, Nick. And Becky?
I think mine's a bit more complicated. I have a question from a girl called Hannah, who says, what are your policies on the integration of immigrants into Britain? Thank you.
So I think it's really, really important that when people come here and they play by the rules and they pay their taxes and they look for work and they want to make a contribution, we also make it really, really clear that it is essential that they seek to speak the language. I think language is crucial. You can't integrate if you can't talk to each other. And that's why, for instance, we've introduced much tougher rules on where people do receive benefits or go into Job Centre Plus. There's a real requirement for them at certain stages to also make sure they improve their language skills. We can't have a cohesive society if people can't talk to each other. So I do think we should be pretty... This is an example of muscular liberalism. We need to be pretty clear about saying, look, we're an open-hearted society, but when you come here, you've got to make an effort to communicate with other fellow citizens. Do I think the whole debate about immigration can be used as a scapegoat for...
Or is it being used? Because even politicians aren't talking as much about the abuses done by bankers or big corporations not paying their taxes.
Well, look, first things first, can I do something very unfashionable and stick up for politicians of all shapes and sizes and all parties, which is that we...
Stop you there, Nick.
Will you be serious? We have to respond. We are, as I say, we're servants of the public. And if the public tell us, I'm like any other jobbing MP, I'm out in my constituency in South West Sheffield knocking on doors all the time. And if you hear people over and over again saying, we're really worried about it, you can't just ignore it. That's what
but you address their anxieties.
Yeah, you address their anxiety.
And you can actually say the percentage of how much immigrants take on benefits, etc., compared to tax avoidance.
Sure. And I hope I've tried to in this conversation to strike that balance, and that's what I always do.
I don't think you've struck it at all. I don't think you've struck it. You haven't talked about tax avoidance and the fact that immigrants aren't as much of an issue as corporations, and you look at the banking crisis you keep bringing up.
Well, that's not... I don't think that's fair. I actually said earlier to... It's Jack, isn't it? Sorry, Tom. I said to Tom earlier, I totally acknowledge it's just a fact. It's a statistical fact. Immigrants access benefits actually less than many people think. But I said, which I think is equally important, because it's very important, not you're doing this, Miles, but don't sneer at people's fears. Fear is a very powerful...
I'm saying anxieties are genuine.
Well, exactly, they're genuine, so you've got to address them. So you've got to be accurate about them, as I have been, but also address them. And even if a rule is not being abused on the scale that people might think, if that rule is not being fairly applied or is not designed in a fair way, you should fix that, which is why I think, you do need to have these changes in benefit rules. It doesn't mean you don't talk about what happened in 2008, which in my view, as I said right at the outset, is one of the biggest hammer blows to our country and our society because of what the bankers got up to, probably since the Second World War.
OK, right, what did you make of Nick's immigration policies? You've been voting and the results are in. Let's have a look. 61% yes.
Creeping up.
Excellent. OK, remember, Leaders Live is about you, our online audience. Let's take a look at some of your final comments and questions for Nick. Jolien Rubbs, how are young people supposed to believe any manifesto pledge after the tuition fees debacle? Tom Lyles Severn, why don't Lib Dems join forces with the Green Party in the next election? And the final one, Strategos Art, are you for or against the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership? We've heard from that one quite a lot. You spoke about tuition fees. TTIP, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'll tell you. So I would never endorse TTIP, which is a big new deal which is being negotiated between Europe and America, unless it was absolutely crystal clear that we're allowed to do exactly what we want with our public services, with our cherished NHS, without being undermined by TTIP. And, we as a government are making sure that is clearly, there in writing by the EU negotiators and the European Commission for us to see, so there's no threat to the NHS, which I know is a fear that's been raised. I would never endorse TTIP if that were the case. I actually happen to think that if I want my children and my grandchildren, assuming my son's, you know what I mean, if I want future generations to live in a world where the standards are set by kind of our hemisphere in Europe and across the Atlantic in America, and not just all set on the other side of the planet in Asia or Latin America, then actually having the kind of America and Europe sort out some things together, I think is in the long-term interest for us for us all as we move, ever more in this more globalised world. But it cannot, must not, will not happen at the cost of our right, our sovereign right to run the NHS as we want.
And people will always come before profit.
Yes.
Promise?
As far as the NHS is concerned, you bet.
OK, right. If you've got more comments and questions for Nick, tweet him at Nick_Clegg. It's a big thank you from Nick, our studio audience, the teams at Bite the Ballot, ITV News, Twitter, and of course you, our online audience. Next year, we'll be back with the leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron. Changes will not happen overnight. Remember the power of participation. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Register, vote and turn out. Good night. Thanks, Nick.
Good at this.